Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the show. We are Education for the 21st Century. We're a monthly podcast brought to you by Lehigh University, the College of Education, and the programs in educational leadership. We focus on challenging issues present in the U.S. educational system and society today. We bring attention to concerns such as educational leadership, school and community, innovation in education, research to practice, and social and cultural dynamics in schools. And we try to bring together experts to discuss challenges and present solutions. Today, we have with us Dr. Darius Prier of Duquesne University. We are honored to have Dr. Prier here today. And as I was saying off camera, Dr. Prier and I go way back, even to a time when before he became, sort of the great scholar, administrator, and sort of spokesperson he is today. And we'll probably get into a little bit of that. But we're honored to have Dr. Prier with us today. And as always, we are also so happy to have Dashina Kabaz, doctoral student in educational leadership, and also my GA on my own journey here, at least right now. So Dashina, I'd like to say welcome at this time.
Thanks so much for the wonderful intro, Dr. Beecham. And I'm going to introduce you all today to Dr. Darius Prier. Dr. Darius Prier received his PhD in educational leadership from Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, and BA and MPA degree from Wright State University. Dr. Prier is a former Associate Dean for Teacher Education in the School of Education and currently an Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Foundations and Leadership at Duquesne University. He was also the inaugural chair of the Faculty Council and has played an integral role in the curriculum development for the School of Education's EDJE program in educational leadership. In addition, he is currently a committee member of the Education Deans for Justice and Equity, EDJE, a national organization committed to transforming schools of education towards more equitable ends for vulnerable populations. In his research, Dr. Prier uses prophetic criticism as an intellectual and methodological practice for interrogating interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches to educational leadership with their moral, political, and social justice context. Thank you so much for being here today with us, Dr. Prier.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great introduction. So thank you all for having me.
So if we can just start with the first question is, how did your graduate school preparation prepare you for the work that you do?
It's an excellent question. If I had to say three things, intensive writing and research would be 1, 2, preparation for conferences, and 3, our program was centered around equity and justice. So let's start with the first one. Everything that we did in our classes required an extensive amount of writing and rewriting and research. I can remember in one class where the actual writing project that we were engaged in, for me, it ended up turning into a very short article, but an article nevertheless, an encounter, Education for Meaning and Social Justice. And so that had a tremendous impact on me in terms of thinking about myself as a scholar. I know that in another class, we did ethnographic snapshots, right? So we actually went out into the local community and began to do certain kinds of observations of the scene in which we were in. And at that time, it was a popular cultural scene that I had chosen. And so, and to begin to come back and map out those themes and code those conversations and then synthesize the data was an invaluable experience for me. And then the fact that our program was centered around equity and justice. Sometimes you have graduate programs that may seem like a bunch of disparate courses. And so our particular program was very explicit about saying, we are about equity, we are about social justice, we are about democratic education. And so even if the faculty approached their work from different kinds of epistemological lenses, there was still an anchoring around justice as an end goal or democratic education as an end goal. And so there were foundational principles and practices, if you were, that everybody adopted when they were part of that program. So, and in terms of that and how that work has prepared me today, I think you can see traces of that work in everything that I've been doing. So currently I'm a committee member of a national organization, as you just talked about, Education Deans for Justice and Equity, in which we are rethinking the culture of how we think about schools of education, right? That if we are truly talking about justice, that is a question, a critical questioning about not only our epistemological constructs, but also thinking about where learning happens and when it happens and the ways in which it happens, right? And then if you are in a leadership position, how are you constructing the curriculum and pedagogy in a way in pre-service teacher education programs or ed leadership programs? How are you designing the classes and the curriculum and the programs in such a way that can facilitate that justice work? And so, so really critically questioning the status quo. I just launched our Equity Education Certificate program in the fall of 2020 this year that I'm very proud of. And so we have pre-service teachers now that are going to come out with a certificate that's specifically geared around culturally relevant or responsive education, equity, literacy, and social justice. And so very proud of that. As you all know, we are in an increasingly diverse demographics across this nation. You know, in Pittsburgh, we have about 1,108 students from the English language learner community. 53% of our students are African-American students, 33% are white students, and 53% of our students represent students from different countries, right? 55 different countries, something like that. So I give you those numbers to say that our, you know, the demographics are increasingly getting diverse. And so the idea of an equity-oriented project is increasingly important. So it's prepared me for a lot of what I'm doing today. And that's a testament to the Department of Ed leadership at Miami University, Oxford.
Oh, man.
Wow.
Excellent.
And that,
Sheena, go ahead.
that's just amazing to hear that you're able to, sorry, Dr. B, but it just made me start thinking about that was really your foundation in your educational experience. And you took these components and pieces and tools with you of education and justice and propelled it forward to apply to rethinking of schools in all different types of angles and ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Critically important. Absolutely.
Well, this, you know, Darius, that first question leads us into the second one. And the next question is, how were you mentored in the academy and how do you continue the legacy of mentoring? And speaking of mentoring, I think the last time I saw you might have been during the retirement of Dr. Michael Dantley, who was a mentor to both of us. But to see all of the scholars who came out for his retirement, it just showed generations of, you know, just scholars through the academy who have all been connected through folks like Michael. But can you talk a little bit about mentoring, how you were mentored and how you continue the legacy of mentoring?
Absolutely. So this is a full circle moment for me. And, you know, when I was in the program, I began to hear about UCEA, University Council of Educational Administration. And at the time, I really didn't know if that was a fit for me. I'll be honest with you, because at least in that iteration, and Dr. Beecham, you have more history of the organization than me, but it seemed to be much more traditional in terms of how we think about school leadership, you know, in the traditional status of a superintendent or a principal. And while I considered myself to be an educational leader, I did not consider myself to be an educational leader in that way and in that capacity. Now, having said that, we need great principals and we need great superintendents. And so this is not to cast any aspersion on that, but I didn't see where I would fit within the organization And Dr. Dantley, who's a great mentor of mine out of Miami University, he said, no, it's because of the work that you do and how you do it is why we would like you to be a part of the organization. And so I got introduced to the Barber Jackson Scholars Program. And that is a program that recognizes the need of the underrepresentation of scholars of color in the academy, in the field of education and their leadership. And so I got connected to that organization through the Barber Jackson Scholars Program. And so we're paired with mentors. And so the mentor that I was paired with is the person you're looking at, that I'm looking at through the screen, Dr. Beecham. And so we began this mentor-mentee relationship, and that has lasted today. And this is why I said that this is a really kind of a special moment. And what I appreciate about the mentoring that I had with Dr. Beecham is one of the very first projects that we engaged in real work. So it wasn't this thing of let's, talk on the phone and get to know you. No, our first project, Dr. Beecham, I don't know if you remember, was conceptualizing a critical discourse around hip hop in educational scholarship and research. Yep. And it was in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. Yep. And that's a top tier journal, right? That was my very first top tier journal with Dr. Beecham. That's what we did, right? That's incredible. So I was not even in the academy yet as a professor, and that was the first work that we did together. And through that relationship with him, I understood that there's other folks that want to do this work around hip hop and popular culture, and that you're not insane for engaging in this kind of work. And thus began my journey. And so he's been great in that way and having that working relationship. And since that time, he's been a great mentor in the way that if there are certain projects that have come up, he's invited me to be part of those projects. And so I've worked with him on that. Dr. Dantley was really great at getting me out there, I will say, on the national level of going to conferences. That was something new to me. That was a big deal. I remember when I was a student, I said, man, I would love to be able to present with Dr. Dantley one day. And next thing I know, I get a phone call from him and I'm presenting on the same stage, right? And so that was mentoring, because you're introducing a young scholar to the world of academia and how to present one's work and to receive critique and feedback and to continue to improve on your thinking and your scholarship and how you want to collect your data. All of those things, right, were nurtured in that conference going kind of environment. And then I was also mentored by the late Dennis Carlson. And really he, it was always a dream of mine to write a book, right? I couldn't tell you at the time what I wanted to do after that, but that was a personal dream of mine. And I thought that was it. Like, I didn't imagine all the things I'm doing today. I didn't imagine any of that. I just wanted to write a book. That's all I wanted to do. And so I think after I got the book done, I'm like, okay, what do I do now? Because that was my whole thing. And so, that was a process where with him, I would submit something to him and just have, blood all over my paper, and blood meaning the red pen of the ink of him just really ripping me apart on my writing. And I thought I was a great writer, but he's like, no, you're not on that level yet. And so I needed to be humbled and go through that process and that grind of learning the nuances of what it meant to engage in book writing. And then also I have to give a shout out to Dr. Weems and Dr. Denise Talaferro Brazil, who were also great mentors of mine. And so Denise also does a lot of work in pop culture. And then Dr. Weems, she was great with methodology. So I've been mentored in so many ways by great, wonderful people who chose to invest their time with me. And I'm not here without any of the individuals that I mentioned. And so in terms of how am I continuing my own legacy of mentoring others, I would probably say right now at this stage, because we've downsized a lot in our department, I've been mentoring a lot of students in their dissertations and coming up with what we call their problem of practice, of getting specific about what do you want to know? Why do you want to know it? And what's the purpose by which you want to know it, right? Let's start there and get very clear about what your area of concern is. And let's start there before you start thinking about whether I want to do qualitative or quantitative. No, what do you want to know first, and how do you want to know it? And what's the purpose by which you want to know it? And if you can answer those three questions, then we can get into some of the deeper conversations about your lit review and about how you want to collect your data. And so that has been my very specific mentoring right now, is that I have a lot of doc students in my lap that I am nurturing along the way.
Okay, that's fabulous. And it's just so good to hear kind of your mentoring trajectory, and to also hear that, you're continuing that. And, and as you know, always when you talk to me, I always have something for you. I don't know if you've, do you have a Jackson Scholar mentee or mentee now?
I don't think I have a formal mentee. It's been really interesting that I've stayed in contact with the Barber Jackson Scholars in one way or another. And so I have always been around. So some years ago, they invited me back as a guest panelist. And so I did a lot of work with them in service to the students in that way. And then, of course, when we're out, I'm with a number of students, meeting with them at lunch and dinner. Yep. And so I've never left. I just don't have any, any formal mentee, as it were. But it's not to say that I certainly can't have one, but I've never been away from Barber Jackson Scholars.
Well, look, I probably should say the same, that, I did a bunch of mentoring back at once upon a time, but now I'm just kind of around, maybe not as so much of a formal capacity, but what you've probably realized, that sometimes if the responsibilities start to increase at your home institution, then that may limit your time to do things on a broader scale.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Capacity, right?
Yeah.
You have the capacity to do nationally, statewide, and then service at the university level. Absolutely.
Yep.
And Dr. Prier, it's amazing to hear also how all of your mentors, they bring you to who you are today. You wouldn't be who you are without them, and the fact that they really embodied the meaning of what it means to be a mentor and engaging in that real work. So thinking about your work and the work you do, you mentioned prophetic criticism. Can you explain to us what that means?
Absolutely. Prophetic criticism, I owe a huge amount of debt to the framing of that work to Cornel West in what he calls the cultural politics of difference in a text that's called Keeping the Faith. And so that's where I have based that work out of. But prophetic critics are cultural critics and artists, right? There's three, and they're cultural critics and artists who evaluate text from moral and political judgment. And there's three challenges that West articulates for the prophetic critic in this particular moment. And there's the intellectual challenge, there's the existential challenge, and there's the political challenge. For scholars of color, the intellectual challenge is butting against the grain of how culture has been conceived in education, in society, and in the academy. So Matthew Arnold, in the cultural studies world, would frame culture as the best that has ever been done and said in the world, right? That was his framing. But the problem with that is the best that has ever been said, done in the world was not inclusive of persons of color, okay, right? So there was this promulgation of cultural inferiority and authority of the capability of persons of color, of intelligence, of beauty, of just the degradation of their humanity, of being seen as uncivil and barbaric, right? And so there's a whole, the prophetic critic seeks to demystify how we have been conceived in this realm of how culture has been conceived from this Eurocentric standpoint. And so what he goes on to say is that there were three particular responses post World War II that that had to be that intervened in response to these kinds of conceptualizations of culture. And so one, you have during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, you start to see kind of decolonization methodologies or critical social theories, right? That were talking about this critique of issues of power and issues of culture and issues of ideology, of asking critical questions about whose voices are included or excluded, whose voices are silenced, whose voices are privileged, what narratives are being put forth in the academy that are controlling the direction of how we think about culture in the academy. And so that was one response from critical scholars. Two, you have this idea of the influence of, you have this reenvisioning of American history, right? And so the ways in which American history was told was from a Eurocentric perspective, right? We still have to fight the battles around Christopher Columbus, right? We know he didn't discover America. He actually was one of the preeminent figures who started the transatlantic slave trade, right? That's not necessarily something that we don't think about Christopher Columbus as a domestic terrorist, right? So there had to be this re-envisioning of American history. And three, the third response was the influence of popular culture on intellectual life. And so that's why that's been critically important for me in the intellectual challenge. And so those of us who are prophetic critics, we see ourselves as New World brigadiers, right? We draw from different disciplines. So not only critical social theories that analyze power, culture, and ideology, we also draw in cultural studies that centers culture, everyday lived experience, representational practice, and subjectivity. We also bring in critical race theory, right? And how do you center the everyday ordinariness of race and how race is socially constructed. And so if it's socially constructed, it can be reimagined. There's also the idea that because there were stock narratives told from white privilege, that there had to be counter narratives. There had to be a counter narrative storytelling to reinsert voices of color into the culture and history of society, right? And so I try to interweave in an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary way, critical social theory, cultural studies, and critical race theory to imagine what I'm thinking about of prophetic criticism of pop culture and educational leadership. The existential challenge for us is, as scholars of color, we always have to weigh, right, Dr. Beecham, how are we going to navigate this thing called the academy, right? Wes says that one of the options that we think about is the Booker T. Washington assimilationist or accommodation kind of mentality, where we don't question anything. We go along to, to get along the system as it is, right? There's no disruption of the system. There's no challenging of the system. You just simply assimilate and accommodate to the system. There have been others who think about themselves as being a part of what Wes calls the talented 10th, right? The Du Boisian talented 10th. But he says that can be unintentionally maybe, but it can be parochial. The fact that you're going to be a part of this talented 10th of the few to help the many sounds also a bit elitist. Even if you weren't intending it to be that way, it could come off as very elitist. Then how many of us, Dr. Beecham, have been at the point where we just want to go it alone? We just want to go rogue, right? We're not really feeling like we fit in the academy at all. And so we just go rogue. And, he says that's not going to necessarily work either, although he understands the intention, but, that's a recipe for burnout, and that you need others to help sharpen your sword and your epistemological thinking of how you're trying to grow as a scholar. And so he recommends being what he calls a critical organic catalyst, right? And so critical organic catalysts recognize the need to, when and where appropriate and where relevant, how do you utilize your the intellectual and epistemological and methodological tools from the academy when and where necessary. But you are saying that is not the only strategy, that you also recognize knowledge that comes from subcultural communities of resistance, that knowledge may come from the hip hop community, knowledge may come from the church, knowledge may come from the hip hop shelters that I've worked in, right? So, and so there's this this interplay between the academy, schools, and the community, that we understand the need to work across those different boundaries, which brings next to the political challenge, that when you have been in a system that has been so reified with its rigid regulations, with its quantification of efficiency, with this the culture of commodification, where consumerism comes as a way of thinking about democracy, of persons as objects rather than agents of social change. Those are the threats, right, to the particular culture. And so he says that there must be a certain kind of coalition building across different groups, different racial and ethnic groups, as well as progressive white brothers and sisters. And so how do we build cross coalitions within that political challenge? And so that's what he offers as that. And so I situate myself within those three particular challenges and how I'm trying to constantly formulate myself as a prophetic critic who has a critical disposition of how I analyze the world, within power, culture, and ideology, and then how am I not only critically conscious about public social concerns, but what am I imagining as possibility? What am I imagining as justice? What am I imagining as fair for particularly vulnerable citizens? And I do that in many ways through cultural analysis of pop culture, because pop culture tells us a lot about where we are as a society, how we think, how young people think about their identities, and then its relationship to the social cultural context of social justice.
Wow, man! Look, I thought I was in class.
You know, I told you, I told you I came with the passion, man. I love being in this environment, and it's when you have been doing a lot of leadership work, but administrative work, it's refreshing to get back into the nature of the work that I do. So that's what you're hearing is I'm just really excited about.
Oh man, I'm just so happy you still have the passion and the fire, man, because similarly, as you know, I've been in the role as the program director for educational leadership here for now probably well over a decade. And I'm saying this on the full public forum now, that I will be stepping down finally from this role, and I will be on sabbatical in the fall.
Okay.
And I would, I also look forward to doing the same, getting back deeper into the research, back into the scholarship, finishing a few research projects, Tashina, that we have going. But and we can get into this in a little bit too, because sometimes when you get into administration, right, you really go into it. So much of it is it's meetings, it's routinized work, it's dealing with things that are not inherently intellectual. So you spend a great majority of your time doing those things, managing, organizing, responding, emails, phone call, meeting. Well, now at the same time, the academic expectations of research, scholarship, teaching, and service don't go away. So I kind of wanted to know, because you ended up accepting an administrative role pretty early in your career. So how did that go? And two, in terms of how did that adjust your timeline towards full professor, if you don't mind me asking?
Wow.
And Tashina, I know I jumped off script, so I'm gonna eliminate question 4, and I'm gonna go with that one. Okay.
No, that's a great question. So I'm going to be honest with you. I was not running toward that position. So the position to which we're talking about, of course, is Associate Dean for Teacher Education in the School of Ed. And I did that from 2019 to 2020, right? So I did about 1.5 years of that particular position. And then what happened is the dean to which I was, the cabinet to which I was in under the dean at that time resigned. And so the deanship is much like, I always say, like a presidential cabinet, right? You know, it's like you have your core leadership group, but when that person steps down, then pretty much they're going to restructure. At least this is the way it happened for us. They restructured the leadership team, and so now there's a new team in. You might know, well, you know, Dr. Gretchen Jenneret,
Yes.
Dr. Beecham. So she's there now as the interim dean.
Ah, yes.
And so she is now there for, I think, 2 years and really trying to help the school reimagine itself. And so she's got 2 years to kind of shore up, you know, whatever the university is desiring, you know, that of how it wants to structure the School of Ed. So, so she's taking care of those politics now. But when I was there, so there's a couple of things. So as I talk about the role of prophetic critic and how I navigate the academy as a person of color, I live that, right? So for me, it's not something that I just write on paper, but I actually try to embody that. So when I am in meetings or when we were developing our strategic plan, you know, 2 pieces of that strategic plan was advocating for justice and equity, and the other one was fostering community engaged learning, right? So that was, I pushed for those kinds of things, right? Because I believe in those kinds of things within the leadership structure. It's not just something, again, as a scholar, as a researcher about those things, but it needs to be embedded within the social fabric of what it means to lead. And part of where I think schools of education or colleges of education struggle with right now is you can be a leader with, I mean, you can be an administrator without being a leader, right? Versus being a leader who happens to be an administrator. And it is the latter where I think we need to be, right? So yes, you have a title, but are you a leader? Are you considering the type of decisions that would impact the students that you serve? Are you making value judgments, which we all do, whether we admit it or not, but certain kinds of value judgments, but value judgments in a way that's going to make the space more equitable. And so on the one end, I think there was a lot of great opportunity for me. So when I was there, we were able to hire 2 faculty of color that I strongly pushed for. And it was just, you know, believe it or not, sometimes those things are very weighty processes to do that in institutions in which there's not many faculty of color. So I was able to accomplish that. I was able to accomplish the Equity Education Certificate Program. I'm very proud of that. That was also something that I had to fight for. That was not something that's just a pre-given. That's something that if we are talking about how to change what we think pre-service teachers need to be prepared for, right? Then that means we have to design the curriculum in such a way that will prepare them for the populations that they're serving. 90-some-odd% of our students are white female students. There's something to be said about we need to diversify, right? The population of our future teachers, and there's a whole history around and historical backdrop around at the time of Brown versus Board of Education of 1954. At the moment of integration, a lot of Black teachers got demoted or fired or displaced, hundreds of thousands, right? Now we ask the question, where are they? Well, you fired hundreds of thousands of them right at that time of integration because our white community did not want to be educated by Black folk, nor did they want their daughters and sons to be sitting around Black children. That's just the truth of the matter. So one piece of that, we need to continue to think about how we diversify our recruitment of future teachers. But the other end of that, with the teachers that with the future teachers that we have, they are on the front lines, right? And I explain that to my students. You all are on the front lines. Many of the faces they're going to see are what's here in this classroom. And so if you never lived around, played with, or interacted with communities of color, right, in order to prevent culture shock, you're going to have culturally relevant or responsive education, or equity-oriented education, or social justice education, however we call it, cultural competency. We have so many different words now for you know, when we're talking about equity. But so it's me really pressing within the leadership team of saying this is something that's very necessary. And so we were able to finally get the support for doing that. But having said all of that, Dr. Beecham, in terms of that process, when you are the lone African-American person in leadership, and when you are an African-American male, right? Sadly, in 2021, that's still not a normal thing, right? And certainly not a normal thing when someone is I'm very passionate, very committed, and very assertive about what I consider to be, we are trying to reorganize schools of education because we're trying to save lives. You know, we're trying to increase access and opportunity for vulnerable communities who face life and death on an everyday basis. So I come to the table with that in mind of how am I making decisions in such a way where the structure of schools of education can be a conduit for social change for the communities that we serve, right? This cannot just be about privileging standardized testing as the measurement of intelligence when we know that's a one-dimensional measurement of intelligence, and we know that. But we continue to organize and structure what we do around things that we know empirically are not designed to bring equity across diverse populations. I press against that, right? And so when you truly believe in this social justice work and you are challenging people to be true to what they say they're about on paper, there's going to be some uneasy conversations, you know, and I'm willing to be unpopular in those conversations because I'm thinking about the children who reside in these underserved, under-resourced, and underrepresented communities, who have high teacher turnovers, who have 30, 40, 50 students in class, who are experiencing unemployment, loss of businesses, and you know, who are strapped for cash and are going through issues of poverty and homelessness, right? I'm thinking about that lens. I'm not thinking about how cute we can make ourselves look. This is life and death for a lot of children. So I don't have time to be popular and make decisions that are going to be comfortable because I'm thinking about the children who can't breathe.